Hello and welcome to our final webinar of the day. You have joined the webinar entitled Planning for Progression Using Learning Graphs. This webinar is part of the CAS Virtual Showcase, which is a 2-week window of webinars designed to support the CAS community. My name's Wendy McLeod and I am the CAS Community Outreach Manager for communities across London and the East of England. Joining me this afternoon are our two presenters, Ben Garside and George Bukes. Ben is a learning manager for the Raspberry Pi Foundation, as well as a CAS master teacher who co-hosts the CAS Durham community. Having taught computing in a secondary school in the northeast of England for 14 years, Ben now works on making resources and online courses for the National Centre of Computing Education. George is also a learning manager at the Raspberry Pi Foundation, developing educational resources for teaching computing in secondary education within the National Centre for Computing Education. He was a secondary computer science teacher in Greece for many years before joining the foundation. During the session, please use the question window on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions. All attendees are in listen-only mode. The top of the window has an orange rectangle which can be expanded or collapsed. If using social media, the hashtag for the event is hashtag CAS Virtual 20. I'm now going to hand over to Ben and George for the session. I hope you've brought a nice cold drink with you to relax in this hot weather, and sit back, relax and enjoy this webinar. Thank you, Ben.
Okay, hello everyone. Really pleased to have everybody here to find out what we've got to talk about. So what we're here to talk to you about is learning graphs and how we've used them in the work that we've been doing to help us plan for progression. And to just give you a bit of background about that, as Wendy introduced George and I, we both work for the Raspberry Pi Foundation, but our work is centered around the National Centre for Computing Education. And in particular with that, the work that we're doing is around building resources. So I try not to use the term interchangeably, but I might talk about the resource repository or I might talk about the Teach Computing curriculum. They are the same thing, because we've been developing resources for the last about a year and a half, so that it can be taught all the way from Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 4. George and I are secondary teachers, but the concepts that we're going to talk about today are not unique to secondary. They can definitely be applied to not only secondary, but also primary and other subjects as well. So to give you a bit of background to some of the work that we do and how we've got to the stage that we've got to with learning graphs, is that a part of what I talked about just then is that we've been tasked with producing 500 hours of curriculum content. And so I'm going to just very quickly show you some of the work that we've been doing. And that'll maybe have that in the back of your mind when we're talking about the learning graphs. So hopefully you can see this, and maybe when you can tell me if you can't. But you haven't yet come across the Teach Computing website, this is it. And within that, if you were to put Teach Computing /resources, you will come across this. So these are this is a beta page at the moment, which means that we've got a deadline of July to get all the 500 hours of content completed. So we're not quite there yet, although very close. So this website will change its look in the near future. But what we have is, if we scroll through it, you can see we've got units for every year group. If we go down to Key Stage 3, you can see it's separated by every year group. We've got things for Key Stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. So just give you an idea of what that looked like. If you were logged into the Teach Computing site, you can go to like access Year 8 resources or Year 7, and that would take you to a Google Drive page. And you can access these resources. You can download them, copy them to your drive, or download them if you're a Microsoft school. And if you take one of these units, and I've picked the Year 7 programming unit that we put together, what comes packaged with every unit is a number of lessons. So we have 6 lessons in every unit. It's slightly different to Key Stage 4. And in each lesson, we have a lesson plan, a slide deck, any assessment that goes with the units. That would be some summative assessment worksheets, but also some formative assessment as it goes through the lessons. So just give you a flavor of that, we have these are some of the lessons. So the lessons come with a slide deck. They have We have a lesson plan as well, and inside the lesson plans, we give an introduction, we have timings, all the resources that you need for these lessons. And also we try to address any kind of misconceptions that might arise in the lesson for you to be aware of, to make sure your students don't pick up on those misconceptions. So going back to the slides, that was just a bit of a background to what we've been doing over the last year and a half. But obviously what was forefront of our minds when we were doing this work, and really important part of our work, is making sure that we get the progression right. So what we've been developing is something called learning graphs. So each unit also comes with a learning graph, and that will show us, we're going to talk about in today's lesson, how we've used that to help us plan, but also help us to inform how the lesson and the structure and the order of the concepts that students need to grasp, how they flow. So at this moment, I'm going to pass over to George, who's going to talk you through that part.
Hi, welcome from me as well. So Ben has shown you part of the end product of what happens when a unit is finished and what it includes. But learning graphs are currently mostly used for planning, and it comes before the process of actually writing the resources for each unit. So essentially, if you think about 500 hours worth of material across all key stages, that's a really massive job to be able to plan all that. So we try to figure out different ways that we can help us plan our units. And what we came up with after studying some of the literature was what we call learning graphs. And essentially, the first part of this is describing what they are. And as any graph, any network of nodes, a graph is a network of nodes. So in learning graphs, our nodes would be anything that a learner would find across their learning pathways. So it could be concepts, it could be skills, it could be knowledge. Because of the fact that we use them for planning our units, essentially in our learning graphs, the nodes contain the learning objectives we will be using in our lessons. If you think about it, when you start planning a unit, that's always what you start with. But instead of us putting those objectives in a list, what we try to do them is connect them using links. So next slide, Ben. So the next step, rather than just listing our objectives, is to try to connect them. And the connection, the arrows there, are not thinking about how we would teach them. It's thinking about what is a prerequisite for each node. So essentially, we start ordering the nodes, but it's a partial order. It doesn't mean that necessarily all nodes are connected. And you can draw an arrow between two nodes only if the previous node, the source node, is a prerequisite for the target node. That is a very special process, and anyone who has tried constructing a learning graph will tell you that, because essentially you start thinking about requirements essentially, and the pathways, the different pathways that the learners might take, rather than specifically how you would teach the unit yourself. So in the following, just try to keep in your mind that this is not, the arrows don't represent the order you teach, but rather what really needs to come before something else in your learning pathway. And this is the reason why links can be bidirectional, because sometimes you can teach in one order, but also the reverse order might also make sense. And we've also found that it's useful to characterize some of the nodes as soft, which means that it is beneficial if learners have are acquainted with some concepts before the ones that come after them, but it's not necessary, and we denote them by using those dashed arrows. I'm right now. Cool. So a question that people might ask is whether or not this is something new, whether organizing knowledge and learning trajectories is something that we propose, and that's not the case. There's a really big amount of literature around learning trajectories in mathematics especially, and also some physics and science. The reason we tried to use a different name was because it's not exactly the same thing. So learning trajectories, there are some differences. Learning trajectories are usually quite abstract and conceptual, and that's essentially the main criticism of trajectories, that they are too far removed from the actual teaching process. Our learning graphs are sort of directly linked essentially to how we are actually going to teach our units. And the problem with the learning graphs is that at this stage, because of the fact that there's not enough research to direct us toward what the nodes should contain, this is something we sort of make up as we go along, in the sense that we get together, we discuss what should be the contents of a unit, but there's no research to back that. But there are ways to remedy that, and we can talk about that next. Ben? So we're going to take you through the construction of a learning graph to have it so you can use them yourselves, and also understand how the learning graphs you will see in the Teach Computing curriculum, how they've been generated. So when we have to plan a unit, we start with a list of learning objectives, but the second step, which is the most crucial one, is try to establish a relationship, try to think what the connections between the nodes are, and should two nodes be adjacent in the learning journey. And just so that you can get a feel for that, we're gonna ask you to do an activity now that Ben is gonna describe.
Okay, so what we'd like you to do is do a bit of the thinking that we did when we were planning the Year 7 units of work that we did. So this was all to do with the first programming unit for Year 7, so moved up from Year 6. So we wanted to get them a foundation understanding of some key programming concepts. So what we've got is an activity for you to do, which again, in just a second, if you follow this link, that'll take you to the part where we actually create the nodes, the generation of the nodes. We've done that bit for you. What we'd like you to do is think about, they're all in relation to variables, selection, and iteration. What we'd like you to do is spend about 10 minutes just looking at them and just spending a little bit of time seeing if you can put them in an order that would make sense to how you think they would learn in your classroom. So if you follow that link, and it will take you to a Google Drawing. It'll ask you to copy it, so it makes your own copy of it. And we'd like to just give you about 10 minutes to see if you can put those nodes in the order, and if you want to establish the relationships between them by using some of the arrows that we've put in there to show what needs to be connected to what are the prerequisites to the next objective or node that you've put in that order. So what I would say, if we maybe reconvene at 3:24. And then we'll go through the next steps.
Just keep in mind that drawing an arrow doesn't mean that this is the order you would teach it. It just means that one node needs to come before another.
Okay, if you're still hearing this, what George and I would like you to do, if you do complete this or would like to share what you've done so we can look and maybe discuss it, then maybe if you could post a link to what you've done in the chat. So you'll see once you've made a copy of it, you can click on share. And if you were to click on share, then you get an option to make it a kind of a public link that you can share with everybody in the chat, and maybe Wendy can forward that to us and we'll take a look.
Yeah, they can respond in the questions section. So if they put their responses into there, and then I can bring them to you. Thanks. Donna's saying she's not able to access the link shown. I'm not sure whether she means the one that I've sent out. Oh no, she's got access now. It's okay. Thank you. Thanks, Donna. Brilliant.
Okay, so we're just going to give 1 more minute, I think, and then we'll move on. Okay, I think we'll reconvene if that's okay, and we'll carry on with the presentation. I mean, it really doesn't matter if you haven't finished, because trust me, it took way longer than us, way longer than 10 minutes for us to go anywhere near getting even those 3 lessons put together. But hopefully just that in itself maybe gives you an idea of the potential pitfalls, the complexities behind this task. So what we asked you to concentrate on was not necessarily the order in which the lessons would take place, more kind of the concepts of what needed to be taught before the other one, before the next learning objective. What we can do is categorize that into something called fluid state. So that's basically what you've just attempted, which is getting the learning graph to uncover the structure, without actually looking at the teaching pathway. But actually, maybe once you've done that, is actually then planning that into a bit more of a structured way that's more helpful to inform the teaching and the order in which you would like to teach it. And that's what we call a solid state learning graph. So just to show you an example of that is that these are learning objectives taken, or learning graphs, sorry, taken from one of our units, which is cybersecurity. So our starting point was to produce these nodes and put them together like this, work out what order in which things needed to be, though that would be a solid if I said that, so which order in which they're going to be taught. More, this is worked out what needed to be taught before the next objective, what were the prerequisites. And you can see it doesn't look necessarily the neatest of graphs, because what we've got here is these in a line here. You can see we've got various different kind of like chunks and blocks of objectives. And what's happening in these is that it doesn't necessarily matter the sequence of lessons, but what does matter is you can see these ticks here saying, well, that has to be taught before the next one. So they do need to have an understanding of the need for data and privacy before we actually move on to what the law says. And if we look at the first one, explain the difference between data and information. Because this unit is heavily focused around what the value of your data and why it's really important that you understand the value and importance of your data, because companies profile it and turn it into information, then actually we can say here it's not actually really essential for them to understand the difference between data and information, but clearly it's going to be really helpful for them to have an understanding of that when we talk about data privacy and what happens to information once you put it in online. So that would be a fluid graph, and then to actually then plan that out into a way in which we would like to deliver it across 6 lessons, we then put it into a solid looking graph. So these are the exact same objective, exactly the same nodes, but the difference, you can see what we've done is we've put them into orders of lessons. And also we started to think about what themes emerged when we started putting the graphs together. So you can see we realized there was some conceptual background kind of knowledge information that we would like them to know. There were clearly some legal and ethical and social issues. There were threats and prevention, because they can be separated quite easily. So from the first one, if I go back to that, you've got something that's useful to inform your planning. And then after that, you've got something that's hopefully useful for whoever you show this unit to, whether or not that be somebody in your department, whether or not that be your leadership team, or whether or not that we would do anything for kind of any inspectors, but obviously this shows to anybody who's looking, then it shows that there is a clear thought process that's happened there, and you've really planned out for exactly how you'd like progression to take place and get the learners from the beginning of the unit to the end of the unit. So I'm going to hand over to George.
And this is relevant to what I noted at the beginning of the presentation, that traditional learning trajectories in mathematics don't really correspond to the way things are taught. Whereas with learning graphs, as you start to move and solidify your graph and move towards this sort of representation, then essentially not only do you capture the interdependencies between the objectives, but you also move to a solid suggestion about how you want to teach that.
And one thing I was just going to show you as well, is that we showed you the nodes that we want you to put together, and we thought it'd be helpful maybe if we show you how we put it together. So we gave you all the objectives that we had for variable, selection operators, and iteration. And I think this took us quite a while to put together, and when we were first planning it, I think we would say, if we were honest, there was a lot of debate about which way round we should teach selection and iteration. People have very strong opinions. I mean, historically, I would say in the classroom, I always taught selection before iteration, but other people did it a different way. So when we were playing around with the objectives, what we really quickly realized is, and something that I'll be honest, I'd never really realized the importance of this concept, that actually what applies to both selection and iteration was that the students needed to understand about Boolean logic and operators, because they apply to both if statements and loops. So what we worked out, well, actually, before students are able to even really grasp selection and iteration, they need to understand operators and they need to understand Boolean logic. So that obviously helps inform our planning, because at that point onwards, once your students have understood those two concepts, then it really makes no difference whether or not you teach selection before iteration. It's completely up to you of how you would like to teach that. But the graph shows you that it is actually more important of which concepts they need to be able to understand to be able to access selection and iteration. So hand over to you again. Thank you, George.
Yes. So this is like a list of things we sort of started realizing as in the team as we started using those graphs. One of the most important things is you can just look at a list of objectives, which is what most planning documents contain, but that comes nowhere near revealing how the content is essentially embedded in a nonlinear structure. And that can only be captured by a structure such as a graph. The most important thing is the second point, and I think you should probably have grasped that while you were doing the activity. It makes it a really special step in the process when you start thinking about the relationship between the nodes and whether something should come before the other. I think this is what makes it really, really different and very useful. Essentially, as you start thinking about the order, you start revealing different ways that you can actually teach any subject. You start revealing possible gaps, because if you find that there's no real direct connection between two nodes, there might be some intermediate nodes that are missing from your planning. And also sometimes we find that there are also redundant nodes in there, nodes that overlap. And the only way to clear that up is by actually looking at this graph structure. Sometimes when we started planning the lessons before the actual learning graph, as soon as we start opening up the learning graph and trying to experiment with it, we really immediately understand what might have gone wrong in our planning process. The graph really highlights that. I think the graphs are also very, very useful in conveying your ideas, converting your thoughts around planning. And also it's very useful as a reference point if you want to debate things with other people, such as terminology and the order in which things are being taught. Having a very visual illustration of what your learning path looks like really helps when you're discussing it with other people. There are also some issues that we came across. It's not a solution for everything. Essentially, if you plan a 6-lesson unit, the whole process of organizing and visualizing that structure is sometimes very, very difficult. It tends to get very complicated. The longest unit we have in the Teach Computing curriculum is a Key Stage 4 programming unit, which takes 50 lessons. So you can imagine how complicated a graph like that might be and how difficult it might be to produce it. And because of that, because they tend to get really complicated and interconnected, it becomes pretty apparent that you probably need something more than a drawing tool to actually create them. You probably need something like a specialized tool that you're able to use and maybe filter out parts of a graph and have functionality like that. Cambridge Maths has a similar approach. They call it the Cambridge Maths framework, and they do have specialized tools for building their trajectories. It would be really, really useful to evolve into something like that. Our presentation mainly focused on how we use the graphs for planning our units, but throughout different conversations we've had with people, and we can also sort of deduce that ourselves, I think they can be used in many other contexts as well. For example, they could be used to inform assessment, making sure that each node could come with a set of tools for assessing whether learners can move on to the next one, for example, and how that assessment might look like. Also, we found it very useful. We've made a lot of pedagogical decisions based on our work on the graphs. There's also another tool that we use for visualization, which is called concept maps. It's relevant. It has the same form as a learning graph, but it exclusively contains concepts. And it's sort of, whereas the learning graph it shows progression and flow, the concept map is more of a static idea. But we found that it would be really powerful to find some ways to combine them. Our hope is that through the resource repository and as teachers use our learning graphs more and more, we hope to capture teacher feedback, and we hope to capture teachers' perception and uses of the learning graphs. We'd really like it to be a collaborative process where people come back with suggestions and ideas about the contents of the nodes and the links between the nodes, because essentially our aspiration is that if we sort of crowdsource the production of the learning graphs, we will start from the ones we've produced as a small closed team to learning graphs that will be evidence-based and empirically justified. I think that covers the next slide as well, Ben. So in that sense, we're going to move on. Sorry, you can have additional information about the graphs. We have a poster in a recent online symposium that the Raspberry Pi Foundation organized. We have a blog post that was written about a year ago when we started using the graphs. We also have a podcast where different members of the learning team discuss our use of the learning graphs. And of course, you can find the learning graph in every single unit in the Teach Computing curriculum. Moving on from what I said before about this being a collaborative process, any feedback or questions or suggestions from the teaching community are really, really valuable in improving them. So I think this is the point where you get to sort of share your experience from the activity and also ask any questions around the graphs.
Yeah, there's just a comment, sorry to interrupt, there's just a comment about the size of the nodes, and I'm not sure whether that's a reference to the presentation or the actual resource itself. I don't know.
If that's, I think I've seen that question. If that was to do with the presentation, then the graph itself, we can share that as part of the slides when we share that as well. But also on the Teach Computing /resources, that's a learning graph from the Year 7 programming unit. So if you were to go there, you would be able to download the whole graph as well.
If I may interrupt, the idea behind the slide was not to actually read what's in the nodes, but to convey how the fluid graphs sort of turn into the solid ones and reflect our teaching suggestions.
Thank you.
I think just to add, before we're taking other questions as well, I think to add to what George said as well is, we hope really as well, I mean, you know, when you look at the graphs that we've produced, it helps you gain an understanding of our thinking process. But clearly also we hope that maybe that you like the idea of them and think that it'll clearly help inform your planning too. So it's not something that we think is exclusive to the National Centre. It's certainly something that we just want to share because we found it was something that was really important for us and definitely helped inform our planning.
Yeah, just to reassure the people that are listening that there will be a recording of this webinar that will be sent out. One person joined a bit later than the scheduled time and was asking about that. So just to confirm that you will receive a recording of the whole webinar. Just again, a comment that one of the attendees said, learning graphs can be useful when creating a scheme of work. So, a lot of positive comments this afternoon.
Absolutely. I mean, that was that was the reason behind we did it. It was, you know, we would consider, I suppose, these blocks of chunks of units to be a scheme of work. So yeah, it's important to emphasize that was our starting point, really.
It's nice to also comment on the fact that you can think of these graphs as working on many different levels as well. So essentially, you might think of the whole Teach Computing curriculum through all key stages as a top-level graph that contains the units and maybe even subsections of those units, because again, that will help teachers understand how our content flows through the years, through the year groups. And then as you zoom in, it's like you're moving into lower levels with higher detail. But again, unless you have a specialized tool for that, it's sort of difficult to convey it and build it into one huge graph, right?
I found that it's certainly something that you can spend, you know, if you wanted to, you could just throw together your nodes, but you're not going to get anything from that as such. And you know, I noted that one person on the question said, you know, it's a quite a hot day to be thinking about this. Absolutely, it does require thinking, and if you know, you could easily spend a couple of hours really, you know, thinking about it. It might be something that you could do as a department almost, you know, so you can get those discussions about what should be taught and, you know, what they consider to be the real key learning goals in every unit, what they should be.
I would encourage all teachers that are present to probably look at one of their units. They will probably have a list of learning objectives. So that would be the first step in producing a graph, but just trying to order them, trying to think critically about the interconnections takes your thinking and your planning to a different level.
David's asked, could mind maps be used?
That's a very interesting question. So it's not exactly the same thing. Essentially, if you know about mind maps have a very clear hierarchical order and they connect concepts and ideas, right? So in that sense, they would be closer to concept maps. Concept maps are really similar to mind maps, but concept maps also have labels on the edges. So they sort of create little sentences that describe the ideas in a unit. So that would really be akin. If you'd like to visit a few of the units in the Teach Computing curriculum do have concept maps as well as learning graphs. So the concept maps and the simpler mind maps would give you a general idea of the concepts covered in the unit, but the actual trajectory and how you move through those concepts are more like what learning graphs do.
I noticed that somebody's mentioned about take into account of different, it also needs to take into account different abilities and prior experiences in the planning. I mean, absolutely. And I think, you know, again, just moving back to that year 7 one, it's, you know, your starting point is going to be different depending on what, you know, your learners have taken on board or what units they've done before they start the unit. So that's really important. I think in terms of taking into account different abilities, I think the graph should allow the teacher to really understand which of those nodes are really important before they move on. So although we've put it in like a 6-lesson unit, it may well be that actually after lesson 4, what we thought should just be 1 lesson, but your learners just need that little bit more time on it. That doesn't mean that you should therefore move on to lesson 5. It means that you really focus on that concept. Make sure, spend as long as you need, making sure that they need to understand that concept before moving on, because if you move on without having done that, then it's going to be hard for them to understand what you intended to teach in the next lesson anyway.
It's interesting that if I just may expand on that just a second, if you look at the graph, there are nodes that are always sort of sync nodes, and a lot of arrows lead into them, and a lot of arrows lead out of them. So these are essential ones. Landmark nodes is what we call them. So that really highlights what you should make sure that your learners understand before they move on.
I just wanted to say we've got a couple of minutes left, and it's nice to end on a high. We've got a really lovely comment from Julie, who says, "I'm hooked. It gives a graphical representation of what I have been trying to do with mind maps only. Thank you." So that's a really lovely comment.
Definitely.
So all left to say is thank you for joining us today. Special thanks to Ben and George for presenting. Please remember to share your highlights from today's session via social media and the CAS website. At the end of this webinar, a short survey will appear on the screen, and we'd be grateful if you take a minute to complete the survey. Additionally, in about a week's time, you'll receive an email with a CPD certificate confirming your attendance at this session. A recording of this webinar will be available on the CAS website in the near future. And coming up tomorrow morning, we've got some exciting sessions for you on BandLab, Adventuron and EduBlocks. We hope to see you at other sessions, and please do continue to spread the word about the first ever CAS Virtual Showcase. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.